Chapter 4, Emergency Secret Council, Part 2. Outside, spontaneous fireworks were beginning to go off. Throughout the entire kingdom continent of Day, from one kingdom to the next, the good folks in castle cities, small towns, and remote villages alike were beginning to celebrate the arrival of the new year. Year 17, Dog Moon Toy 2, 512 Age of Tears. Shortly after sunset, the King's Royal Fireworks show would begin for the good people of Tungulin. Since the city was known as a city of science and magic and laid claim to the largest wizard population in the kingdom, the Royal Fireworks show was to be unprecedented. The citizens of Tungulin and many foreign visitors looked forward to it with great anticipation. Inside the royal reception hall, King Tytal Vantu sat at the head of his large round meeting table, a cross-section cut from a giant woodland tundra tree, staring at the latest arrivals with distant, unblinking eyes. His mind was not on the fireworks and celebrations this night, but on urgent matters of his city. He was an intimidating presence in stature, manner, and demeanor. His robes were always green, tonight laced with thin strands of golden weave. His collar and sleeves were lined with fluffy white ocelot fur. On his head was an ornate crown of gold and jewels with green velvet interlays and sparkling green tassels. Gythotes were born a light tan color, and they darkened with age. Old Tytal Vantu was nearly black. His white hair was like multiple braided strands of cotton, interwoven with black lace and gold beads. His 2-inch lower tusks, which rose from under his protruding pink lower lip and encompassed his broad flaring nose, were capped with gold. His eyes were small, dark, and intense, flaring like flames from the cracked black skin of his face. He looked grim and quick to anger, as did all elderly Gythotes, but Tytal Vantu was known as a compassionate, methodical, temperate king. Gabriel was ushered to his seat, directly across from the king. The boy stood complacently near the door behind him. The room was abuzz with quiet salutations, handshakes, and brief, shallow smiles. Dedlin Dane crept through the door without much notice and found his seat, a few chairs to the right of the king, where a small dish of Kofik beans was set for him to munch. Benjin Binder, the defense commander of Tungulin, was on the king's left. Also in attendance around the table were Guy Hugart, second in command under Commander Binder, Gathargo, the current wizard to the king, Drer Freygood, the king's advisor, lore master, ranger, and longtime friend, as well as Tungulin's chief historian, Saber Johnhausen, captain in charge of the Tungulin police, and 4 castle governors, the mayor, the chief of castle rangers, the royal recorder, the king's personal secretary, and the city sentinel. All 7 royal knights of the guard were present. Behind the king sat the profound inner council, made up of 8, 3 exalted generals who stared from their tall chairs, stern and grim, and 5 of the most renowned, celebrated, and wisest instructing wizards in the kingdom, who watched the proceedings through old eyes buried deep in wrinkled faces. Around the perimeter sat the outer council, 77 other members, many soldiers and wizards themselves. The 2 new castle ranger captains, Lake and Quan, stood in the shadowy corner near the burgundy window curtains at Binder's request. Most had milled in with curious expressions and had seats as the meeting was called to order by the sentinel. All stood for the short prelude glorifying the king, who had just received kingship over the entire Galgarian quadrant less than a season ago, the castle city, Tungulin, and the great kingdom continent of Day. King Vantu took his seat first, leaned to the side, and crossed his heavy legs. "Please, everyone, come in and have a seat," he said informally. His voice was gruff but precise. "I apologize for the lateness of the hour. I'd like to thank you all for coming on such short notice and such a special evening. Much to discuss. We also have a welcome visitor, long overdue, His Majesty Gabriel Dindayan, the Prince of Berger." Thank you, Your Highness, Gabriel replied, standing and bowing appropriately. It is my pleasure to be here. Tungulin has always been my second home, and I would like to extend my congratulations on your new title and territory since I was unable to attend the coronation ceremony. I understand it was quickly ratified by all the other kings. Give your father my best when you see him next, Vantu said. Gabriel bowed again and had a seat. Hopefully this meeting will be brief, Vantu continued, once again addressing the room. I'm expecting one crucial report. But outside of that, there should be no other interruptions. I have received some uncomfortable news this evening, a matter of some importance, hence the urgency, and I seek the wisdom and guidance of my council, so let us begin. Listen closely, he said. Commander Binder, you may have the floor. Binder nodded his angular, clean-shaven head and rose. He was a huge man, taller than the king, with broad, rounded shoulders and a massive square chest that stretched his military garb tight. His arms were large and brown from exposure to the suns, and his fingers were thick and stubby. He was scarred from many battles. In fact, it was rumored that he was largely reconstructed surgically, and that many of his fractured bones had been reinforced and replaced with plasteel on the battlefield, sparking a controversial reputation for making him somewhat superhuman physically. Your Highness, he said to King Vantu, bowing, and then turned to Prince Gabriel and did likewise. Your Highness. Gabriel acknowledged the defense commander with a polite nod. Ladies and gentlemen, members of the council, honored guests, this is Lake Tobias and Clan Methylard. He began, acknowledging the two of them with a nod. They are two of my castle rangers assigned to Westwatch this evening. Little more than an hour ago, 2 hours past inbound Skycraft curfew, they sighted a small Skycraft come in through Erie Pass and go down in the forest near Bondoon. It was aflame. No comlink was ever made, and nothing from that direction had been scheduled for arrival at any port. Thermal tracing leads us to believe it came from the direction of Kalari, and it must have passed West Hill City earlier without stopping. Shortly after the crash, he said, looking much more stern, they then spotted 2 warships following it through the pass. His voice dropped an octave. Worst of all, we have confirmed. They were Garnian warships. The room burst into a quiet uproar, and rightly so. The Garnians were a militant race that lived thousands of miles away to the south and had not been sighted in Galgaraya for hundreds of years, not since they were defeated in the last Great Kingdom Continent War. Are we absolutely sure that they were Garnian warships? John Housen asked. Not from Sissel or from Oleander? Were they firing on the Skycraft? Asked someone else. Please, Commander, the commander continued, his thick eyebrows bristling. I cannot answer everyone at once. Slowly the room quieted. King Vantu squinted hard, deep in thought. It was utterly brazen for Garnian warships to enter territory that close to a major castle city. It was nothing short of military aggression. As I said, it was confirmed. They were Garnian make, Binder answered. The Garnians have also been infiltrating towns and cities in the south, Dreher Freygood said, and scoutcraft have been spotted near both the City of Gold and Dindayan. Warships have been rumored seen in the wilds as far north as Gorn. It is suspected by many that they are preparing for maneuvers, possibly on a major scale. Many men of all races are gathering to join them. It is a fact that the Garnians are recruiting and on the move again. Not fact, just rumors, John Housen replied. Rumors tossed about by gypsies and rogue Scarrow pirates. Saber John Housen was an elderly Doxus in Vantu's police service for nearly 30 years. Like most of the Doxus race, John Housen was intellectual and confrontational, with a sharp mind for details and facts and precise planning and professional execution of his responsibilities. He was highly mathematical and concise, with the notorious ability to see beneath layers of lies and propaganda that most others might miss. Physically, he was short, even for a Doxus, but he was stout and sturdier than most, with gray eyes set wide apart on his flat, frowning face. We need to gather more intelligence before we overreact here, Your Highness. I do not believe that the Garnians are planning an invasion or an attack on us here, not at the time being, Binder continued, but their presence in Galoth requires immediate attention and perhaps reprimand and sanctions. They have broken a 700-year-old treaty that decrees that no warships are to encroach upon another territory's borders. Their presence is in direct violation of that treaty. It is my belief that the Garnians pursued and disabled the aforementioned skycraft before it could reach our city for whatever reason. We shouldn't underestimate the importance of protecting the integrity of this crash site, Dreher Freygood said. Important how? A governor asked. Well, the skycraft was obviously trying to reach our city. Whoever was on board was either escaping or they were bringing a message or news here to us. They were fleeing two aggressive Garnian warships. It is clear that they thought it was important enough for them to risk battle with warships with far superior weaponry, Dreher replied. And it was important enough for the Garnians to shoot it down before it could get here, even if it meant exposing themselves to us right on our very doorstep. Or it could have been a fugitive, John Howson continued, or an escaped prisoner. We do not know for sure. Well, what is the situation now? Van Tu asked. According to screen scan and scouts, the warships have departed. Or are cloaked, Dreher Freygood added. And the skycraft? It crashed 4 miles due east of Bandun near the river, 7 miles from Westwatch, Binder answered. Bandun's jurisdiction, the old king growled. Are you sure that it wasn't a craft bound for Bandun? He asked the two nervous castle rangers. Lake and Clan shrugged, blank-faced. They were too ill-equipped and inexperienced to answer that logistic. It was too far away to tell for sure, Your Highness, Binder answered for them. I agree that we should avoid contact with the Gogmors at all costs. We cannot afford another incident with Gelrwyn. On the other hand, Dreher argued, we can't afford to let them ramshackle the crash site, either looting and destroying whatever was meant for us, possibly killing whoever was on board. How much time before the Gogmors investigate? They could be there even now, Binder advised. I see, Van Tu replied. This Garnian presence is dark news, he said. He turned to his secretary. Prepare a response to the Garnians, demanding an explanation. Include a copy of our treaty, highlighting the sections stipulating the encroachment upon neutral territories with armed warships unprovoked. State our position firmly. Tell them they can expect retaliation if it occurs again. Find out what trade we currently have with them that we might sanction. I believe we sell them quite a amount of foodstuffs and mercantile. I suppose we should send a team to investigate the crash site. A small team of 3 to 5. Should be experienced in evasive tactics, guerrilla warfare, and know the territory, and be familiar with the Gogmors. Binder, you take care of that. Your Highness. A report back to me with any news, and quickly, he stated. Then he turned toward the Knights of the Guard. As far as the warships go, let's send out scouts right away, as many as we can afford in all directions. If there are Garnian warships out there in the Subrings, I want to know where they are and what they're doing. The Knights nodded in response. Hugart, have your people send out coded messages to the other kings via message spheres. Tell them what has happened here and seek their advice, he said. What else? Van Tu asked the room in general. What are your thoughts? Your Highness, perhaps we should go on alert until we know something for sure one way or another, Gathargo suggested. The generals nodded in agreement. A quiet alert so that we don't panic the general populace. Good, Van Tu replied. Make it so. Generals, prepare our warships. I want all soldiers on standby. Chief, put all castle rangers on full alert as well, and have them fully involved in the internal security as well. Mayor, prepare a report for a city briefing. She nodded. Yes, Your Highness. Anything else? Commander Binder. No, Your Highness. Very good. Keep me informed on all fronts. We'll meet here again first thing in the morning, an hour after sunrise breakfast. King Vantu stood to depart, but instead he paused and took a pensive breath. He walked toward the windows facing the south with long, confident strides. There he paused once again, looking out into the night. His voice was not much more than a whisper. Friends, I've been sleepless lately, he said to all those still in the room. I've had a loss of appetite. I've felt very strange, helpless, and yet I feel as fit as I have ever been. I'm restless, as if something very ominous is looming right before my eyes, making all else trivial and pale by comparison, and yet I cannot see what it is. Something important is happening, something grave, and we are not aware of it, although we very well need to be. It is close enough to touch, but like vapor, it is intangible. I feel a movement out there, working its way inward, like the continent is shifting beneath our feet. There are great currents at work of dark ambition and of evil spirit, and I fear we will be swept away if we do not soon recognize and anticipate what it is that is coming for us. I fear dark days ahead, my friends, dark days and hopeful moments. Keep your eyes and ears on alert. Hearts true, swords at hand. Let us be prepared. Sire, the room spoke in unison. Thank you for coming. Thank you all. If there is nothing else, you may be excused until further notice. The room began to rise. Sire, if I may, said a feeble voice from amongst the rising chatter. It was a bit croaky, but still clear and sharp. Everyone turned to the elderly wizard sitting slumped nearby, stirring now like an old faithful dog who had thus far apparently been asleep. If you'll permit me, there is one thing, Dedlin Dane said. Vantu turned to him. Yes, Dedlin. At the name Dedlin, Gabriel and the boy made instant eye contact. That was him, the wizard Dedlin Dane. It's, well, an announcement, no less, the old wizard said, and then under his breath he said to himself, this is going to be interesting. He laughed, just a little bit, as though he were both amused and delighted. Admittedly, the sound of his laughter sounded very odd under the serious circumstances. He pulled his chair back and slowly stood, obviously very stiff. Yes, an announcement of some, dare I say, dramatic importance, Your Highness. An epiphany revealed, actually, if I may say so. Yes, quite so. An epiphany, a legend, and a prophecy uncovered all at the same time. An announcement that directly relates to this meeting as well, I am sure. In fact, in some way, it is the very cause of it, and certainly the cause of this Garnian encroachment. Do get on with it then, Binder moaned. Dedlin slowly circled the table. Firstly, important introductions are very much in order here tonight. Introductions, murmured the king, looking about at all the familiar faces in his chamber. Introductions to who? Dedlin then turned his back to his king and to the council, and faced the young boy who stood beyond, in the curtains, the shadows of the curtains just beyond Gabriel's seat, silhouetted by the hazy evening light piercing from beyond the large garden windows. His smile fell away as he threw his cloak back over his shoulder, and an expression of devout reverence replaced it. He bowed low, hand on the hilt of his sword. Then, as everyone gawked at him in bewilderment, Dedlin went to one knee before the young boy and addressed himself thus. I bid you welcome, Your Highness. I am Dedlin Dane, Sire, Wizard Deluxe, at your service and command. I have been awaiting your arrival with great anticipation for quite some time. For a moment there was an awkward silence, then there came an insulted uproar. What is this nonsense? Cried someone. Old fool, muttered another. He's fallen off one too many horses, replied yet another. Too much of that hazelnut liqueur. Without any hesitation, the boy stepped confidently forward into the light, and all eyes fell upon him. His face shone bright, his eyes were like dual fires as he gazed upon them one by one. He was grim for one so young, standing before such an impressive group of elders and peers. Despite his common clothes, his lordly stance and confident demeanor was very much like that of high royalty, ancient, wizened, and strong. Tytel Van-Tu stepped forward frowning. His jowls shook. "Devlin," he said, trying hard to grasp what was being implied here and still contain his composure. The room quieted again for him to speak. "There is no time for this now. We'll do this later, privately in my chambers if you want." Devlin looked at his king. "Forgive me, sire, but respectfully I must continue, for everything else now pales in comparison. What to do about the Garnians, you ask? Neither you nor I nor anyone else here can make such important decisions now," he said. "I cannot sit still any longer and be silent while a dignitary of such magnitude stands aside unrecognized in your hall. In fact, your highness, he's a traitor," a general shouted. "In fact, your highness," Devlin continued, raising his voice louder, "no further discussion should be made concerning the Garnians or what actions we should or shouldn't take without his consent and approval." "Devlin!" King Van-Tu snapped. The room full of tension grew still again. "I'm not sure what has happened to you over the years, but because you have served me and my father and my grandfather so well, I am willing to grant some leniency towards your disrespectful behavior and allow it to pass as senile dementia. But right now, we have pressing matters to attend to. Please stand down." Devlin cocked his head. "I cannot," he replied, "for this boy's kingdom outranks your own." Van-Tu took another menacing step closer. "Does it indeed? Who is he then?" he asked. "Who is this boy whom you call sire above me in my presence, in my own hall?" Gabriel sat on the very edge of his seat, squeezing the stone key tight in his fist. "Who indeed?" Devlin was still smiling. He turned from King Van-Tu and looked into the faces of his would-be accusers, undaunted by their scowls, insults, and accusations. He looked no less than enlightened. "Members of the Great Council, elders, and authoritarians, King Van-Tu, and all other presiding, may I introduce to you, before you panic and have me executed for high treason, the ruler, heir, and namesake of this entire kingdom continent, His Majesty, King Day of Mead." All eyes went to the boy. Van-Tu looked at the wizard for a moment longer, then his eyes locked with the boy's. They stared at each other as if in some contest of defiant wills, but the boy's will easily equaled King Van-Tu's. "This declaration is nothing less than preposterous," John Hauser blurted. The room instantly rose into another tumultuous uproar. Devlin's proclamation was ludicrous and extremely inappropriate at such a dire time, they were crying. Several stood, shouting and shaking their fists in the air. Some sat and sadly shook their heads. Dreher Freygood wasn't one to pass judgment so quickly. He was one of those who stood, but for a different reason. He stared at the boy keenly, considering and measuring, and within a few moments he, too, joined Devlin Dane, bowing before the lad and taking one knee on the floor. "Your Highness," he said to the boy. The boy nodded to the king's longtime friend and advisor. "Dreher Freygood," the king squawked. "You too?" "Ridiculous," Commander Binder snarled, not sharing in this revelation. "There is no such place as Mead," John Hausen replied, eyeing the boy with vicious contempt. "We're wasting our time, King Van-Tu." Gathargo, the head wizard in the proceedings, also eyed the boy with sharp interest. "There is certainly an Isle Mead," he said, "but these claims are nigh on impossible." Voices bantered in wild debate, rising in a chaotic cacophony. Gabriel looked from one to the next as they blurted out their opinions, but always he returned gaze back to his recent traveling companion, the young man who had remained so secretive throughout their journey together and who now remained so patiently stoic throughout the raucous proceedings. The boy seemed eager to get on with things now as well, rather than needlessly quip and banter. "Quiet!" Bantu suddenly cried out. "Enough of this! Silence, I tell you!" Gabriel glanced up at the paintings on the king's walls. There were many scenes from the old stories, simplified and romantic. The great flood washing over all the lands. The first day with his arms spread to the skies, golden light beaming from his fingertips as he lit the suns in the sky during creation. The dragon wars of Eof, the great sorcerer Osiah Abix, and the floating stones of power. The first coronation of Day as king during his voyage to the island of Mead and the White Sea as a new mortal man. And the birth of his first son, Mikhail Day, complete with silver Ara. Gabriel had been taught the old religions in school, literally hundreds, perhaps thousands of stories and fables and tales and parables, and they were all about this boy's royal, sometimes godlike ancestors, if he were truly who Dedlin Dane was claiming he was. King Day of Mead. Gabriel had never fancied himself a believer, even though he felt as though all the old stories were probably based on reality. What generation of Day was he then? According to the stories, weren't they all supposedly immortal? Could that explain the impossible event on the mountainside with Abad? The boy stepped up onto a vacant chair to get a better view of his doubters. "Thank you, Dedlin Dane," he acknowledged with a respectful nod. The wizard bowed once again. Then, the boy addressed himself to the rest of the room. "Indeed, I am who he says I am," he stated in a loud, clear voice. The room quieted to listen. "I am your king. I am Jameson Day of Mead, son of Mikhail Day the Third, great-great-grandson of the first King Day, ruler of the kingdom continent of Day. I come here to you, Tungulin, in peace. I come here, too, in dire need. Indeed, I come to you for your assistance and your prudent advice, great Castle City Tungulin. I come to you thus, begging, if I must. Unfortunately, your presumptions concerning the Garnians are correct, and I come bearing darker tidings than those shared here tonight. The Garnians, formidable as they are not the worst of your oncoming foes." "Are you going to allow this?" John Howson asked King Bantu. "This is a ruse. We have the security and well-being of the Castle City and the entire Galgarian territory to think about now." Several others concurred. The boy paused his oration, gleaning with an impatient eye. "Silence, I say," Bantu responded, marching around the table, his eyes glancing from the floor to the boy, then back to the floor. "I know what is at stake here," he snapped at his police captain, Saber John Howson. "I must have a moment to think. I must think." The room fell into hushed whispers. The boy stood patiently on the chair, watching King Bantu with a degree of respect and humility. Dedlin Dane remained more than ever pleased with himself. Drer Freygood and Prince Gabriel both looked somewhat pale. Binder seemed genuinely frustrated, as did most of the rest of them. Bantu continued circling the table in thought, hands clasped behind his broad back, glancing toward his elder advisors for counsel and insight. Gathargo and the wizards of the inner council were quietly conferring amongst themselves, glancing again and again, in wonder, at the boy. They seemed rightly suspicious of him, yet they seemed to be nodding favorably. Everyone else began watching them, because their powers of intuition, observation, and renowned wisdom were reputably infallible. They would know if this boy were a fake or not. "Well," Bantu said in a voice that sounded both tired and angry, "what say you, wizards? If there are those who can say whether this be a ruse, it is you." Gathargo stepped forth. Sire, there are some discrepancies with the known stories and prophecies. I see. But, the wizard interrupted, continuing, there is always room for a human error when prophecies are derived from divine inspiration, written and rewritten throughout many generations. We, the high wizards of the Inner Council, concur and believe unanimously, he said, that he is a descendant to the great throne of Day, as he claims he is. The room gasped in unison. Many stood watching the proceedings in stark amazement and disbelief. This was nothing short of living history unfolding right before their eyes. Vantu stared at many of the faces in the room. First one, then the next. Gabriel, he said, almost pleadingly, spinning toward him. I must be sure on this before taking any course of action. You understand this. You traveled with this young man for quite some time. No one here knows him better than you do. What have you to say in this matter? Is this boy who he claims to be? Gabriel looked into the face and eyes of his young companion. The demeanor, the infamous assassins, the key, the accent and strange clothes, the Garnians, the event on the mountainside where he witnessed this boy somehow cheat certain death, the confirmation by the wise. What else could explain all this? The boy's gaze was nothing short of piercing. Gabriel faced the room and spoke. King Vantu, this young man before us all, is King Day of Mead. Of that I am absolutely certain. By the gods, Vantu replied. Could the old stories be true then? We're going to pause it right there and do the final part of Chapter 4 tomorrow. So that'll be Part 3 of Chapter 4.